Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Jacobson, and I'm pleased to be here today with my friend Howard Bloom. And Howard and I both have relatively new books out, and I thought it'd be fun just to have a conversation about some of our books and some of our mutual interests in love, which is opening the solar system and sharing maybe some ideas around growing and expanding humanity into the heavens, into the solar system. Howard, how are you doing today?
Rob, good. So you have a new book. It's called Space is Open for Business. And in one of the groups I run, the Space Development Steering Committee, the group that Buzz Aldrin sort of conned me into starting 15 years ago, we were discussing yesterday how the relationship between life and space is about to change dramatically because of one man and one vehicle. And that one man is Elon Musk, who is probably the greatest visionary of our generation. And the vehicle is called the Starship. And the Starship prototypes have had 3 hops so far. And the Starship is designed to carry 100 humans or 100 tons of cargo into space. So we have had the paradigm all of these years of sending 3 people into space, or in the case of Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, 2 people to the moon. And that's about to be changed radically because NASA has these 2 vehicles. One is a rocket called the Space Launch System, sometimes derisively called the Senate Launch System, because it was designed by politicians, not by engineers. It's a giant jobs program. It's a pork pie in the sky. And the other thing NASA is supporting is a vehicle called the Orion. And the Orion is capsule, just like the capsules you saw splashing down in the early 1970s after 1969. And these 2 vehicles have one problem. They are advertised as taking us to the moon, but they can't take us to the moon. Neither vehicle can land on the moon. Well, Elon Musk's SpaceX Starship with 100 passengers can land on the moon and provide luxury housing on the moon, cruise liner style housing on the moon, and then can take humans back. But not just 3 of them or 2 of them, 100 of them. And that's a radically new paradigm. So in my work, I have this manifesto for the future of life and the future of humanity. This is all a question, by the way, about Space is Open for Business. So in my work, I have this visual manifesto for the future of life and the future of humanity. It's 100 pictures and only 2,800 words. And it's called Garden the Solar System, Green the Galaxy. Because when we take just you to space, you're 100 trillion cells. But 50 trillion of those cells don't even claim to be you. They're massive bacterial colonies garrisoning your gut and protecting it against invaders. Garrisoning your throat and protecting it against invaders, garrisoning your gut and eating the food that you think you can eat, but you can't. They eat it for you. And then what they excrete is what we absorb. It's glucose, which is fuel for us. So take one Rob Jacobson, put him in space, and you've just put an ecosystem in space. But our job is to take green ecosystems into space. So here's the question. We were looking at the Starship as creating an inflection point, a point that's going to change everything, the whole way we look at space. And you have just released fortuitously a book called Space is Open for Business. So why is this the moment? How's that for a long question? So why is this the moment that space is open for business?
I think Starship is a part of that catalyst, Howard, because for too long, space has been about, and let's not even talk about the capability of Starship. Too long, space has been about, it's been about a customizable activity, onesies, twosies, very impressive technology, but nothing that scales. As Elon Musk, I think, used to talk about, if you had to, rebuild your 737 every time you flew it, you wouldn't be able to scale that opportunity. And that is something that he and essentially some other entrepreneurs have been recognizing, that we have to make space scalable. We have to bring the cost down. It can no longer be just for government contractors that are working on a cost plus basis. And although that threatens the status quo. Every time there's a disruption, yes, there is pain points. Yes, there are friction points, but new innovation, new opportunities emerge. And that is why this is an important time. And whether or not, even if spaceship were coming around, I think one of the most important things that SpaceX has done is they've created a price point. You know, when you wanted to send something to space before, it was it was a super opaque market. You couldn't just call up ULA, NASA, the Russians, and say, "Hey, I want to put my widget to space," or whatever. It was pretty much impossible unless you were already in the establishment paradigm. You were a Boeing to get some type of price. The Falcon 9, which is flown dozens and dozens of times, has provided a price point, and that has forced the market to become more transparent and just effectively know, hey, what is the number to get this to space? That is really important. And I think all the other ancillary things that are coming in terms of Starship, repeatability, scalability, is like the frosting on the cake. And I mean, I think that the Starship is like it can be like manna from heaven. Unexpected, it's going to have boundless fruits. Really important stuff. But Howard, you've been looking at this a long time. Did you ever, and you're on the board of governors with National Space Society, have you ever spoke to any of the executives or Elon at SpaceX at any point about your vision of greening the galaxy?
I haven't had that opportunity because 15 years ago, I saw Elon Musk speaking. And Elon said, when I got out of college, I asked, what three things will change humanity the most in my lifetime? And my answers were the internet, alternative energy, and space. So I went into the internet and helped build PayPal. Isn't that what he did? PayPal? I think that was his.
It was. I think he started with Zip, and they merged, and it became PayPal.
Yeah. So at any rate, he said $1 billion off of that, and I skipped over number 2, alternative energy, and went directly to space. Elon had not flown a thing, but I've worked with superstars during most of my adult life. I've worked with people like Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, Paul Simon, people like that. And apparently I have an alarm that goes off in my gut when I see a superstar. And I knew that Elon, that moment, was not just a superstar, that he was a mythic figure, that in the same way that people are still imitating Henry Ford, people would be imitating Elon Musk 110 years from 2005 when I saw him. So I had 4 phone conversations with Elon Musk, who is very much against space solar power, harvesting solar power in space and transmitting it to Earth. Very much against it, and I'm very for it. And frankly, I had no idea why I was calling him. It took me 10 years to realize it's because of that alarm that went off in my gut that said, this is a man of mythic stature, and he's going to change the way we see everything. And so I couldn't explain why I was on the phone. And Elon is a busy man, had a lot of stuff to do, and said, well, I'm not really getting anything out of these phone calls, so we should end them. So since Garden the Solar System, Green the Galaxy was something that I started with in something like 2017. And I haven't had a chance to talk to Elon about it. And Elon is the cutting edge. It's Elon and Jeff Bezos. Well, Howard, but Jeff Bezos hasn't produced any results yet.
Okay, so there's several things I'd like to unpack there. So, Elon, one of the those who are naysayers of space-based solar power on the other side who are against it say that the price for terrestrial solar will fall well below we can have the opportunity to essentially transmit power to Earth from space, save it for using in other parts of the solar system. It's an argument. But with Starship coming online, and the big difficulty has typically been on launch costs, and if SpaceX is able to bring down that cost to the place where it could, then you could be doing manufacturing on orbit, bringing space stations, bringing space-based power stations, or building them on orbit. And I think that could be the part that makes the argument more in your favor.
Well, a couple of things. First, on what you mentioned about bringing price down. Um, the Space Launch System and the Orion, which are NASA's program, they're utterly committed to them. It'll cost $1 billion per passenger to carry out the Artemis program, to land a man and a woman on the moon. For the price of getting one passenger to space on the Space Launch System and Orion, you can get 1,530 passengers to the moon's surface on the Starship. And the Starship can land on the moon, and the Orion and the Space Launch System cannot. All they can do is swivel around the moon in orbit, watching as the Chinese land on the moon.
So then is that, talking about the SLS, this new launch system, does the conversation need to be shift that politicians and those in leadership, the bureaucrats and autocrats, need to say, look, this is just a jobs program and we have pork in our districts, and either we continue this as a jobs program, or we say, look, there might be some minor interstitial pain and we find a way to transition this program into something else and have an honest conversation.
It has to be transitioned. It has to be transitioned into the elements of an infrastructure for the moon. What will happen when we land on the moon? There's no place to stay aside from the Starship itself. There's no habitation. There's no construction equipment with which to build habitation and bury it so that it doesn't, to protect it from radiation. There is no ice harvesting equipment to turn lunar ice into hydrogen and oxygen, into drinkable water, into breathable atmosphere, and into rocket fuel to refuel rocket ships. And those are elements we need. Now, right now, private industry, especially Elon Musk, is developing the rockets. So NASA doesn't have to be in the rocket business anymore. It can take its $3 billion a year that it's been spending on the Space Launch System and the Orion and spend it on infrastructure so that when we go to the moon, we can go to stay. We have some place to live. We have air to breathe. We have water to drink. We have rocket fuel to take off and come back home. So that's what we're calling for in the Space Development Steering Committee right now, taking the money away from the SLS and the Orion and focusing it on developing infrastructure.
So that makes sense intellectually, Howard, but it seems like, politicians want votes, they have pork, and, they want to be reelected. Is there maybe a disconnect in the storytelling that telling a better story so that the politicians can articulate, or their press or their staffers can tell to them, this is how you win an election. This is how we're going to make the economy strong in our district. It feels like there's still something missing because many year after year, some of these advocacy groups, which I appreciate and I've participated in as myself, do lobby for this. I've helped this, but I seems like there is a gap where these programs like SLS still continue.
Well, story is a necessity, and we made a discovery about that a month ago. I run another group that's loosely called the $2 billion Moon Program group, and it includes David Paterson, the former governor of New York State, a Democrat. It includes Newt Gingrich, an arch Republican. It includes Robert Walker, who was the head of the House Science Committee, and it includes one of Newt's, the person who writes all the papers for Newt. And David Paterson set up a meeting between himself on the phone, because it's COVID time, but with Kristen Gillibrand, a senator from New York State. And I explained to Kristen Gillibrand that harvesting solar power in space is the Green New Deal. Harvesting solar power in space and transmitting it to Earth can end all man-made contributions to global warming, all of them. It can end all man-made greenhouse gases. It can end the use of fossil fuels for energy generation completely, forever. And according to my former partner in this, unfortunately he's former because he died, but Dr. APJ Kalam, the 11th president of India, harvesting solar power in space and transmitting it to Earth can lift 2 billion people out of poverty. Well, I've just given you all the elements that the most extreme aspects of the Democratic Party want. An end to greenhouse gases, an end to fossil fuel use, and lifting people out of poverty. But that wasn't what Kristen responded to. What she responded to was the last item on the list, which was by 2035, the Chinese intend to completely own the space solar power industry. And if they do, they will own the 21st century. And that's what motivated her. Because stories have heroes and villains. And we are up against the Chinese. They plan to make us a has-been. And they're already in the process of doing it. And they plan to use space to do it because they see the unending resources of space. And they see how you can lift the hearts and minds of the Chinese by telling them they are going to colonize the solar system, and then they are going to colonize the universe. The Chinese will be the people who are found throughout the universe at some point, distant point in time. And they're on that path right now. And we, frankly, the Chinese have this vast visionary system called the Belton Road Initiative. We call it the New Silk Road. And it involves 66 countries, 3.3 billion human beings, and is mobilizing $20 trillion in capital. And the Chinese have bought ports all over the world, including Piraeus, which is the port of Athens in Greece. They have ports all around Africa. They have ports in South America. They even, I believe, have a port in Washington State. And they're turning these into ports that can handle vessels of a kind the planet has never seen before. And they use high-speed rail. We're still using the rail of the 1950s. And they intend to install high-speed rail that can take goods all the way from China to Spain and England. And it's a vast visionary thing. And with it, they will own the 21st century. We, on the other hand, have leapfrogged them if we know it, if we realize it, if we recognize it. How? With Elon Musk. With Elon Musk dramatically driving down the cost of access to space and making it, he wants to make those Starship flights as regular as airline flights to space. And he wants to put his first cargoes on Mars by 2022. 2022. And if the Starship is functional by 2022, then he's going to be able to do it. So there's the economy that space will open is going to be vast. I mean, in Guarding the Solar System, Dream the Galaxy, I explained that once upon a time, there was a poison pill of stone. It was the mother of all catastrophe. It was the mother of climate change. It was a gravity ball in the sky circling a mediocre yellow sun. And supersized molecules started an extraordinarily strange and impossible experiment. They were the first life, and they were determined to take over the place. They were imperialistic, they were colonialistic to the nth degree, but their task was to survive on this appalling planet where every 3 hours the temperature went up 88 degrees and then went down 88 degrees. Every 3 hours we went from being scalded by a toxic stuff called radiation, to being chilled by an equally toxic environment called darkness, called night. And then this planet, the mother of all climate catastrophes, the mother of climate change, had a tilt in its orbit around the sun. And that tilt caused massive climate change every single year. We call it summer, winter, fall, and spring. And in the whole, this planet has had 142 mass extinctions. So life's goal was to reach out, spread out, grab as many inanimate dead atoms and molecules as you could, and seduce and kidnap and recruit them into the process of life. And to do that in enough amazing, astonishing, novel ways that by the time the next species die-off happened, life could survive. And it's done that through 142 mass extinctions. So life has greened and gardened a poison pill of stone, a disastrous source of climate change. And if it can do that here, there are billions of gravity balls in the heavens above our head. And they are all waiting to be gardened and greened. And the resources that they can provide to creatures that are clever enough to not see them as hostile stuff but to see them as opportunities, are endless. And humans have a certain obligation. Look, we have convinced ourselves that we have used up this planet's resources. That couldn't be further from the truth. For every ounce of biomass on this planet, there are approximately 100 million ounces of dead stuff just waiting to be kidnapped, seduced, and recruited into the process of life. But you can say, but you're talking about despoiling the planet. You're talking about raping Mother Earth. Well, there are bacteria 12 miles beneath your feet and mine that are turning granite into bio stuff and bringing it into the system of life by turning it into food and fuel. If bacteria are smart enough to see that we are standing on a planet of infinite resources, why are we so dumb? But more important, bacteria can do research and development brilliantly, and sometimes they outpace us. They've certainly done it. Viruses have done it with the COVID, the coronavirus. But there's one thing we can do that no other creatures on the face of this planet can do. We can get beyond the gravity well. We can get beyond the atmosphere. And once you've gotten beyond the gravity well, getting anywhere else in the solar system is easy. I mean, you could practically push off from someplace with your hands, and it would take you a long time, but eventually you would get to Mars or Venus or wherever it is that you are going, if you've made your calculations right. So it's up to us to take life where it can green and garden those poison pills of stones in a stone in the heavens. And that means that the economy we develop in the sky is going to be the next great economy. So if the Chinese control it, that's the end of us. It will be the Chinese century. If we can get there first, then it can be the American century all over again. And we have the means to do it, and the Chinese don't. Why? Because we have Elon Musk, and because we have his Falcon Heavy, and we have, more important, his Starship. So we must get to the skies and develop the space economy if we are to beat the Chinese.
Thanks, Howard. Howard, do you have any insight on the current, there's some experiments on the X-37B that the United States Air Force has in orbit, and apparently there is one and perhaps two space solar power experiments on it. Have you heard any inside baseball on that?
Well, my friend Paul Jaffe is the one who's been developing that, and he's terrific. But the modular tiles that he's been developing, I don't know the details, but I believe that they transmit, instead of transmitting microwaves, they transmit laser signals. And because they transmit laser signals, if you're trying to beam power down to Earth, space solar power harvested in space down to Earth, using lasers, you can do it, but you run into a small problem. What happens when I put my hand in a laser beam? Well, there's a shadow, right? And the laser beam does not make it to the surface of my wall. The same thing happens with these things called, see if you've heard of them, clouds. And they can stop a laser beam. And to provide power, you need to have reliable power 24/7. It has to be the same strength of power all the time. It can't go phasing in and out. So Paul would have to beam his laser beams down to giant Goodyear blimps in the sky with great big photovoltaic panels on their top that could then convert that laser light into microwaves. And it's just a little bit too complicated. Northrop Grumman, I normally distrust the SMIC, the Space Military Industrial Complex, because they've been killing America's space program for the last 50 years in order to put as many billions in their pockets as they can get. They take every program that's available and they delay it infinitely because they make their profits off of delays and change orders. But Northrop Grumman has been given a $100 million contract by the Air Force Research Lab to develop space solar power. And they intend to have their first space solar power satellite, their first operating space solar power satellite, up in the heavens by 2022. And it operates with tiles, modules, that have a photovoltaic surface on the top. So they harvest the light of the sun and they turn it into electricity. and then have a microwave converter in a sandwich underneath that, and then have a radio frequency amplifier or transmitter on the bottom level of this tile-like surface. And these things can be controlled by software to take that power that's made by 100,000 tiles and to focus it the way you focus with a lens, and to focus it down on a spot on Earth where you're transmitting it. And the transmission is done with microwaves like the microwaves of this, your cell phone, which you use all the time, and you're bathed in these microwaves constantly, and yet they're harmless. In fact, in the time that in 1922, 600 radio stations were licensed in North America. And from that time on, we've been wading and bathing in a sea of radio waves. And some alarmists have told us that those radio waves are harmful to our health. Well, guess what? We've increased in lifespan roughly 20 years in the time since we first started bathing ourselves in radio waves. So apparently these things are harmless. You might even argue, though I would believe it was a specious argument, that they're good for our health. Because look what's happened to us. We've gotten healthier. In my lifetime, which is longer than your lifetime, I've seen getting into your 70s, which used to be a matter of doddering and senility, change. And people in their 70s are young and vigorous. My friend Paul Salmon, who is the business and economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, 5 years ago tweeted that he had just interviewed a 90-year-old economist who was at the top of his game, and that 90 is the new 60. All of that has happened while we are bathed in radio waves. Maybe those radio waves are good for us.
Fascinating. So it doesn't sound like there is a lack of resources, Howard, whether it's creative or financial. It sounds like maybe we need some paradigm shifts of maybe the conversations and people's thinking to whether it's reprioritizing spending if you're in Congress, or developing new technology ideas. That it doesn't sound like there's a dearth of, when companies still have money to develop space-based solar power satellites or develop rockets that aren't going to actually ever go to the moon or do very much, but just keep a bunch of engineers employed.
Right. So yeah, if we see, look, Elon Musk is the Flash Gordon of the 21st century. I try to come up with a better example of a classic hero, but I can't think of one. And he's going to change everything. And to the extent that we understand the mythology of his origins or of what he is doing, we can understand how humankind, through one man, is taking on the challenge of space and making good on what Mother Nature demands of us, which is taking nature to space. In our the terminology of guarding the solar system, greening the galaxy, there's a phrase, and it is bring life to space by bring space to life by bring life to space.
So I'm going to guess, Howard, you don't really spend too much time thinking about the planetary protection comments, even though Mars has been we've been exchanging, life or dust,
Yes. No, I think the whole planetary protection thing is utterly false. Yes, it's useful scientifically to find out if there have ever been microbes or any other form of life on Mars. But hey, evolution is all about change. Invasive species are evolution's way of doing things. Humans, when they got to North America, were an invasive species. In fact, they started killing off all the big animals, like the woolly mammoths, which was outrageous. When humans reached Australia, they killed off all of the big walking birds. Humans killed off the dodos. This is not good. We should not be doing this. But invasive species are nature's way of doing things. When Charles Darwin was studying the iguanas of the Galapagos Islands, which was a central part of his development of the theory of relativity, those iguanas were not native to the Galapagos Islands. They were an invasive species. They had somehow managed to swim or drift in the ocean over hundreds of miles to get to this place where they didn't belong. And yet by the time Darwin arrived on the scene, they were the indigenous species. And every species that we regarded as indigenous was once upon a time an invasive species. Nature's all about invasive species. Look, nature glories in challenging herself. Nature glories in overcoming herself. Nature glories in producing radically new realities that put the old realities in a corner. I mean, once upon a time, there were no multicellular beings. All beings were single-cell beings who lived together in groups of trillions. And then the innovation came up 700 million years ago of multicellular beings. Well, you could say, hey, man, that's raping nature. You know, what does that mean for all of those really natural beings who are single-cell beings, who, by the way, once upon a time raped the planet and turned it upside down and inside out and totally recast the atmosphere chemically. And yet the outrage of multicellular beings has accomplished astonishing things, including accomplishing consciousness. And in the process, nature has overturned her own rules, gotten beyond her own boundaries, raped herself, if you want to put it that way, hundreds of thousands of times, possibly hundreds of millions of times. Nature glories in producing radically new realities. And we are her fingertips. We're not the only ones. Bacteria are her fingertips too. We are her tools of exploration. We are her antennae. We are her ways to feel. We are her technique or her tools for feeling out the next possibility space in which we can make amazing and unbelievable things happen, because nature has been making amazing and unbelievable things happen ever since the Big Bang, which is an explosion that simply couldn't have been, that simply shouldn't have been, that broke all the rules of the status quo that it existed up until then.
So Howard, this is maybe a slightly speculative, but it connects with one of my, it's a very important book to me, Genius of the Piece.
Aha, right.
So here's my copy, my autographed copy, and it's an excellent book for those who've not read. It's a radical revision of capitalism, and it is so much fun to read. And if you've not read it, I challenge you to read it. And it's a wonderful book. And there was a section, Howard, on, and I actually had marked it, and you talking about how just your discussion here, it seemed appropriate. The chapter is called "What Does Crash Create?" And at the end, I think this is the end of the chapter, you said, if technocycles don't power the cycle of boom and crash, what does? Why do Great Depressions happen over and over again? And then I'll skip a little further into near the end of the paragraph where it says, the cycle of exploration and digestion, the cycle of insecurity, could it really be that you and I are part of a search engine of a universe probing her possibilities? Could boom and bust really be turns in the wheel of an evolutionary search engine, a secular genesis machine? So my thought is, right now in 2020, we have the pandemic, social unrest, economic uncertainty, wealth inequality that it's been a long time since we've had the type of wealth, this, gaps and range, the haves and the have-nots. Do you see some impressive change that's going to happen because of these, let's just take the social unrest, the economic challenge, and then the virus colliding all, that's maybe going to actually help us accelerate our evolution into who knows what?
Well, according to that book, according to the Genius of the Beast, we have cycles of exploration. Those are periods of boom. And we have periods of consolidation. And in periods of consolidation, we look at all the things that we have invented since the last crash, and we see the flaws in some of them, and we build safety nets to protect against those flaws in the future. And that's what we are apparently doing, especially with racism in this particular crash. I mean, we've been overdue for a depression-sized depression, a Great Depression-sized depression, because those happen every 60 years. And when we were tickled by the beginnings of a depression in 2008, I mean a catastrophic depression, we managed to evade it. And this may be the next Great Depression, we'll have to see. But in 1918, just after the worst war in the history of humanity, one of the first three major industrial wars, where producing death became an item of industrialization and mass production, of all things, the deaths of human beings. And it looked like the world was about to go through a radical revolution and cast off the shackles of capitalism, which I think are shackles of creativity. None of that happened. I mean, there'd been a revolution in Russia in 1917, and Russia had been taken over by Lenin and the communists. So, of course, that had to happen here, because look at the upheaval caused by World War I. And then in 1918 to 1920 came the Spanish flu and killed between 50 million and 150 million people globally, depending on who's counting. And surely these would produce vast revolutions all over the globe, right? They didn't. What came next? The period that came next was called the Roaring Twenties. And if anything, it was an exuberant, extravagant manifestation of capitalism at its best, at its most creative, giving the big fuck you sign to the status quo. So periods like ours produce in the 1930s, in the Great Depression that lasted from 1928 to 1938. Up until then, if there was a panic, which is what crashes were called back then, if there was a panic, you ran to your bank as fast as you could to take out your money, because you knew that only the first people in line would get their money, and there would be lines along the block, and 90% of the people in that line would not get their money. And as a consequence, they would not have money to pay for groceries. They would not have money to pay their rent. They would be thrown out on the street. Well, guess what happened in the Great Recession of 2008? Our credit cards still work. Our banks still work. We could still pay for our groceries and our rent. That's a privilege, unlike any privilege any humans have ever had before in a period of crash. In a period of crash in 1790, humans starved. They simply starved to death. Their bodies stacked up on the street. We have gone so far beyond that that it's ridiculous. Our greatest depressions, we lived through them. Look at the way we're living with COVID. In the 1970s, the internet was introduced. For the first 20 years, only college professors and Department of Defense people had access to it. I ached to get access to it. In 1983, people like me were able to get access to it. By the late 19 or mid 1990s, a whole bunch of people had access to it. Now we've discovered we can work from home and be more productive, not less productive, more productive. And we can take care of our kids and their education at the same time that we're getting our work done, which is astonishing, which means we don't need office buildings anymore. I mean, the history of office buildings is interesting. Until the 1800s, an office, if you were given an office, it didn't mean you were given a space with a desk. It meant that you were given a responsibility, like if you were given the office of tax collector in France. It meant you collected the taxes. Nobody cared where you did it. So you set up a desk in your home to handle the process. By the 1850s, people like the publisher, the major publisher of the time, had an establishment. What did the establishment mean? It meant he had his key authors living with him. And the guy who founded The Economist magazine had his establishment right down the street. What did that mean? He had a big enough house that he could put his editor there and his sub-editors there. But there was no common office space in these buildings. Why? Because something hadn't been invented yet. And the something that created the office was something that was introduced around 1890, by which time there were already telephones. They've been around since 1876. And typewriters, they've been around since 1876. But the office revolution came because of a centralized data device, a database device. It was called, are you ready, the file cabinet. And once you had file cabinets that kept all your records, of all your dealings with, let's say, your printer, if you're a magazine publisher. Then you wanted a central space where people could work, so all of them, if they did something new with the printer, could walk over and put a record of it in the file cabinet and find the records of everybody else who'd ever dealt with your printer. So all of a sudden, it became useful to bring people together in a common space so they could all get to the goddamn file cabinet. And thus was introduced what we know today as the office, a space with a desk in it. And from the invention of the office came the invention of the office building, a whole building dedicated to spaces with workspaces for people crowded around, guess what? The file cabinet, the common database. And then came the internet. And then came tools like Google. And all of a sudden, you could get access to your database from your car, on your cell phone, from a cafe, from your home while you were trying to tutor your kid and make sure that he was sticking with his homework. And everything changed. The office became unnecessary. The office building is becoming unnecessary. This is something I predicted in an article called The iPad as the Next Guillotine 10 years ago in Ray Kurzweil's publication, Kurzweil AI.
Howard, in one of our first in-person conversations, I think back in 06 or 07, I was publishing a newspaper, and you prognosticated, you said, think about hyper-local journalism and being able to get news to your neighborhood. And we now have things like, Nextdoor and just in the whole, and of course, almost everyone knows about what has happened with the disruption of the newspaper industry. And because it used to be that it was a very centralized, and now anyone can be a journalist essentially.
Right.
And they can blog and tweet and use Periscope and Twitch and YouTube, and we can discuss the pros and cons of each. But essentially, if we have one of these tools, we can document and get truth. Like in 2020, what we dealt with the George Floyd murder is that people had their phone. Something that I still wonder is, why didn't anybody do something? Though that's something that I don't hear too often. Why didn't somebody come up to the police and say, look, this man's dying, and which is not as well addressed in the discussion, that there were people. And that sometimes concerns me about people just taking photos and videos and so concerned about uploading and sharing it, but forgetting about we are humans and alleviating human suffering.
Right. Well, I think they're scared to death that the police will do the same to them.
That's probably true.
And if they're black, which in all probability they are, if they're shooting something in a black neighborhood, then yes, they're fair game. The police regard them as fair game. So yes, a technology, having a camera, a video camera in your phone, is changing the nature of our relationship to the police. I mean, just 10 years ago, if they told us that they killed George Floyd because he was carrying a weapon and threatening them, we believed them. And they planted a weapon on the scene just to show us. And now we can see what is really happening, and it's revolting. And it's creating a revolt against police brutality, and the fact that these police regard blacks as fair game. And now we've had books giving us the history of this, going all the way back to the time when the slaves were released after the Civil War, and how the South built up groups of thugs whose whole business was to keep the blacks in a new form of slavery, a form of slavery in which they were allegedly free. And beating up and killing blacks in order to make a point was a frequent happening. So it's continued as a tradition. But we would not have all these people in the street protesting against this injustice if it weren't for those videos. Watching the George Floyd murder, watching the police murder a human who's human just like you and me, and who should be alive today because he was young and strong and healthy, it created a form of outrage for which there are no words. And it created the form of protest we see in the streets. But that's one of the aspects of a period of consolidation, where you see the flaws in a tool that you've been using. You see the harms that it does. and you build safety nets to prevent those harms in the future. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now.
So in a sense, we're in a transitional phase right now between the social unrest, the economic uncertainty, and nature's gift of COVID, COVID-19.
Right. And it isn't the end of the world, no matter what it seems. And again, if you really want to stop greenhouse gases and global warming, just use space solar power. It won't be easy, but nothing good is easy. Electrifying the United States, producing electricity that could reach every home in the United States was not easy. It cost the equivalent in today's money of trillions of dollars to achieve.
So you mentioned a name briefly, and I want to come back to him, a man named Jeffrey Bezos, the founder of Amazon and a space company called Blue Origin, for those who don't know. And he started the company around the same time as Elon Musk founded SpaceX. And he's gone on some would say a slower pace, although he, I guess, allegedly is debuting his big rocket called the New Glenn in 2021-ish. We'll see. But essentially at the moment, he has not flown at the tempo. He's not gone to orbit. He's done suborbital flights. It's just a different operation. But I do appreciate his vision, which is billions of people living in the solar system using free space colonies, kind of an O'Neillian vision that I appreciate. Do you think that he might subscribe and getting on board to using New Glenn for maybe space-based solar power? He's got Amazon. He needs power infrastructure. You know, that there might be an opportunity to engage with him using space-based solar power that could be an interesting application for his the infrastructure he's developing. And then also, did you ever get a chance to speak with him? Because I know he was a speaker at a National Space Society event several years ago at the ISDC.
Well, I did an article for Scientific American for their blogs on creating a permanent transport infrastructure in space. And Jeff Bezos picked up that article, which was rerun in Salon. So he picked up the version in Salon and he tweeted it out to his God knows how many followers. So I was at that ISDC, the National Space Society's annual conference, the International Space Development Conference, 2 or 3 years ago in LA when Bezos was speaking, and I ran into him in the bathroom. And I said, I'm the guy who wrote that article that you tweeted out a few years ago. And he treated me as if I was an irritation or didn't exist. And there's good reason. He was about to go on stage. He was psyching himself for going on stage. He didn't have the extra mind space for somebody couldn't even remember. So I haven't had an opportunity to talk with him, unfortunately. And I may never get the opportunity to talk with him because now that he's outrageously rich, everybody in the world wants to talk to him. But the New Glenn is going to be obsolete before it ever arrives. The Starship is just going to change the whole nature of the business. And yes, we will need smaller rockets, but we've got the Falcon 9. And as you alluded to, the Falcon 9's had roughly 70 successful launches so far. And Falcon 9s are now taking off. First stages are taking off and then landing again and being reused again. One Falcon 9 rocket has been reused 5 times. Elon wants to reuse these rockets 100 times. The way buses are reused, the way planes are reused. The analogy that you brought up to the 747 went something like this. Supposing I offered to put together a trip for you to New York City so I could see you again because I miss you. This is, of course, after COVID when we're able to actually have dinner together. And I'm going to put this whole trip together for you. You can bring half a dozen friends if you want. And I'm not going to charge you anything for my services. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy you a Boeing 747 that's going to meet you in LA. You'll find it at the airport waiting for you. It's going to fly you to New York City. After it lands at the airport in New York City, JFK, we're going to take it up in the air again, and we're going to ditch it in the Atlantic. Then, when you want to come home again, we're going to buy you another Boeing 747, and we're going to fly you back to LA. So all you have to pay for is the cost of two Boeing 747s and the crew. A Boeing 747 is about $350 million these days. So you'll have to buy two of those. That's $700 million. And the crew is going to cost a pittance, another $30,000. So all it's going to cost you is $730,000 for your trip to LA or from LA to New York with half a dozen friends. $730 million. So that's the way NASA does space. That's the way up until now the leading launch company, United Launch Alliance, which gets a subsidy of $1 billion a year just for existing from the government, has done business. Elon has changed that. He's stopped throwing the planes away. He's kept them. And he says he wants 100 launches of cargo on the Starship before he ever puts humans on the Starship. And this last week, he did his third hop test of a Starship prototype. What does that mean? It means he's gone roughly 450 feet into the air with the rocket, and then he's landed again, which is unheard of in traditional space territory. Absolutely unheard of. And his goal is to use each of these things 100 times. And he says the hardest part of getting to that hop test last week was not building the Starship prototype that hopped. It was building the factory that will mass produce starships.
Yeah, he's thinking very closely about production. He said, look, the flying part, they can kind of know, they can figure out, but he has said the challenge for them is going to be getting production right. And it's really, I think, a really high quality aspect to Elon that they're investing heavily into getting the production right up front. So this can be scaled and you can have a shipyard of these, and we'll see, many of these flying.
Right. And so back to space is open for business. So how do you use, I've read the book, and the book came before the Starship was as far along as it is now. But what businesses do you see opening in space?
Well, let me give a little prelude to that. We are writing a white paper right now with my colleague Keegan Kirkpatrick on Starship that we're going to be releasing pretty soon. So that will be
great.
kind of I think you'll find it useful. That'll focused on Starship. So there's going to be that, outside of the book. Application. I think that people need to kind of get out of the launch mentality. We've got plenty of launch there. The interesting things might be thinking about, advanced propulsion to get us faster around in the solar system. And I know guys like Jeff Grayson and the who's with this Dow Zero Foundation and Electric Sky. They're looking at applications of how do you move things around without carrying your fuel. And there's some.
Well, the Chinese have an answer. And it's something that has been dreamed of in the space community for at least 60 years. And it's nuclear propulsion. And that is an absolute part of their plan. It's no longer speculative. Nobody's urging people to do it. It's in their plan. And they have a timeline that goes all the way up to 2049, by which time they intend to basically rule the Earth. So what are the alternatives to nuclear propulsion in terms of scooting around the solar system as fast as you possibly can? Cutting travel times from 3 months down to 3 weeks, or hopefully 3 days.
Yeah. But that was just one, but the propulsion part is just one part of it, Howard. I think the near-term business stuff alluded to for the book, the opportunities are around, I think, pharmaceutical and biotech, essentially lower Earth orbit, the commercialization of lower Earth orbit. I think if one was an investor and looking for, where are they going to be able to get rich? I think lower Earth orbit, which is already being commercialized in bits and atoms, it's starting to happen. And whether you're interested, you're a data person, interested in figuring out how are we going to make money and create new value from assets in the sky, satellites, to private space platforms and the applications will be developed there, or just utilizing the greatest national lab we have right now, which is the International Space Station, and whether it's creating new pharmaceuticals, new materials. I think those are kind of the compelling use cases that you're going to say, hey, this is something that can only happen in the space environment, and it can make us a lot of money on Earth. There's still some open-ended questions, but it's great that there is commercialization happening on ISS. You see things like there's discussion on new types of fiber optic, but nobody's really doing that at scale yet. There's several companies, and they're not all American companies, that are looking at that and trying to develop that. But I have not seen the complete case closed or a pilot program that says, hey, we've wired these two cities and they're getting this higher performance out yet. But essentially, for those who don't know, you can basically hit the theoretical, you can build a new type of fiber in space and get to the theoretical physics limits with that fiber when you manufacture it in space, and it retains those characteristics when you bring it back to Earth, which is important. And that's been sort of another analog or parallel is looking into the life sciences. Could you develop a new drug that you can't develop on Earth, and could it cure diseases? They're working on a vaccine right now for salmonella. It still kills people on Earth. People, maybe here in the United States, they don't think about salmonella, but it still kills many people around the world. So I think there's important work around virus research. I mean, I don't think we're going to see COVID-19 being studied yet on ISS, but why not have unmanned free-flying space platforms that could be doing viral research?
Well, there is a company in Israel that puts together chips that are about this big, about the size of your cell phone, but thinner, and they are tiny labs, and they're labs for biological experiments for the pharmaceutical industry.
I think it's called Space Pharma, right?
Yeah, Space Pharma. And they've been doing this for roughly 5 years at this point. I don't know what success they've had, and I don't know what experiments have come out of it.
I don't know either, but I think they just flew. They think they have some type of platform that they just had a flight, a successful flight. Because I've got an email. I'm on their distribution list. I haven't looked yet, but I think they've had some type of success. So I think as long as we have these groups out there, there's groups in the United States like Space Tango. There's NanoRacks, which helps facilitate taking many of these types of groups to the space station.
One of the members of the Space Development Steering Committee has a dynamite idea for the use of space. When you do get to the age where you're doddering and fighting gravity in order to walk becomes difficult for you, if we give you a wonderful habitat in space where you can enjoy yourself with God knows what all sports you can have, thanks to the low gravity, you have no difficulty getting around because the gravity is low. Even if you want some gravity, you can put these resorts on the moon. And he calls it longevity tourism. And I think it's a great idea because your infirmities go away if you're at 1/3 Earth gravity.
But it'll make the assumption that we're able to get to the moon cheaply, and regular people can participate in going there. But I think that's, as people live longer lives, and certain things wear out, and we're not, and as regenerative medicine continues, which is also I think a strong candidate for doing regenerative medicine research in microgravity. I think these things will be very complementary. Live longer, have replacement organs made. It sounds like a really
that's a great combination.
It's a great combination.
Idea.
But I think the near term is that we still have to build this infrastructure. If they're going to decommission, let's just say in 2029 or 2030, ISS, we're still going to need to do that type of work. We're also not doing any type of developments in terms of variable gravity. Not everyone will want to live or in a lunar gravity type of situation. So I think artificial gravity will be a great place to have hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people being able to live long term and not have to spend several hours a day just focusing on their bone density.
Right. No, I agree with you. The old bicycle wheel style Space colonies that you saw in 2001, A Space Odyssey, that came from a vision developed in the late 1940s by Wernher von Braun, Willy Ley, and Chesley Bonestell. Chesley Bonestell was the artist. And it's still a great idea. If you have a rotating colony, it produces gravity. And there's something that without gravity we cannot do. In a no gravity environment, we can't have babies. The embryo simply, what would be the embryo, simply disintegrates. Embryos have evolved in a gravity environment, and they use gravity in order to accomplish their ends, in order to become full-fledged human beings. And that can't happen in a zero gravity environment. So if we want normal lives, if we want people to be able to settle down in big houses with big fields in front and big fields in the back, and forests and parks and farms, which is something you can do in a space colony, then we're going to have gravity. And means that either we're going to have a giant canister, like a giant can that rotates constantly, so it produces gravity, or we're going to have one of those rotating bicycle wheels to produce gravity.
So Howard, to get to that, I think that shared vision that I think you and I have about artificial or even variable gravity platforms. In my book, I'm sharing steps and ways to better enable the private sector to flourish and the government. And granted, the government is not necessarily about optimization and efficiency, but it has increasing amount of friction points where, whether it's the pressure of competition from China, or reduced, or budgetary reasons. I think there's a compelling case for more public-private partnerships. And in the book, I share many ways for the government and private sector to work together to get to these sort of shared dreams of living and prospering in the solar system.
And hopefully, if you read Space is Open for Business, you'll find ways to get rich investing in space.
So Howard, if you were talking to an investor who's never participated in space, they know who Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are. What would you kind of share with them why they should be receptive and give this area serious consideration?
Well, the satellite industry is something we're totally dependent on. We're dependent on it for these. We're dependent on it for GPS. We're dependent on it for observation of, for example, the fires in California right now, and for observation of what the Russians, who still remain our arch enemies of nuclear weapons, are doing, and what the Chinese are doing, and what the North Koreans are doing. So space has gone from one satellite going up with a tiny little radio receiver making a ping in 1957, that was Sputnik, to a $300 billion industry. That's billion with a B. And everybody's predicting, including your book, that it will reach $1 trillion industry soon. And you want to make money in space? Well, Northrop Grumman has put 2 space tugs up. What are the space tugs for? They're there to take either from 400 satellites that cost between $400 million and $2 billion, and that have been in orbit for 20 years. And their orbit is decaying. So if we don't do something, they'll be caught in the atmosphere, and then they'll burn up in the atmosphere. And these tugs take these satellites and they lift them to a higher orbit, so they won't deorbit. So that $2 billion investment can be saved and can be used to make money. And these tugs are making money for Northrop Grumman. The government hasn't put any money into investing in these tugs. All the money has come from Northrop Grumman. So telecommunications and GPS has been the major contribution of space to humankind. But if you can spot another potential contribution of space to humankind, and a company that is truly capable of making the impossible happen, the way Elon Musk has made the impossible happen with SpaceX, you could get very rich. You could be the first one in on $1 trillion economy.
And Elon might be doing another disruptive activity. He's created, it's not a subsidiary yet, it's part of SpaceX, but there's always rumors about maybe they'll spin it off, called Starlink, about bringing
Yes,
higher speed internet access to
to everybody.
everybody. And that, there are still parts of the world that don't have reliable high speed internet access. So that will just be another disruptive activity. And
And he's using it. He plans to make billions of dollars, which he can then put into his starships, creating a city on Mars, which is his goal.
And in fairness, there's other competitive projects. Amazon's got one. There's talk of Apple doing one, OneWeb. So we're going to have more access, more interconnectedness, better access to all the things we like in any part of the world. So Howard, if you had the opportunity, though, to ask or to tell Jeff Bezos something now, because I want to give him a fair shot. I do want to give him a chance. The man who has just about any resource on this planet and potentially beyond, and he still has many years ahead of him. What would you tell him to sort of, what might you share with him?
Focus on space solar power. You want to use your rockets to create infrastructure, like the infrastructure that helped you rise in the business in 1994 when you started Amazon, and you were only able to start it for a simple reason. There was something called the internet, and it was pervading more and more and more homes. So he wants to provide a similar infrastructure platform for the kids of the future, and put up space solar power satellites. Right now you are putting up ads, I would say, to Jeff Bezos, that talk about the fact that you've ordered 100,000 electric trucks and you are putting your money into renewable resources. This is the ultimate renewable resource. It is the end to the human contribution to climate change. Now remember, this is a planet of climate catastrophe, and climate change is going to happen with or without the human contribution. But we at least can get rid of the human contribution, and we can power the whole planet. The reason that Dr. APJ Kalam, the 11th president of India, my partner, said that space solar power could lift 2 billion people out of poverty is there are still 2 billion people on this planet who cannot get electricity. And wiring overhead lines, like the ones that we use in North America, could cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. But if you beam the power down, you can reach anywhere you want. Want to be transformative the way Elon is being transformative? Well, Mars is taken. For all practical purposes, the moon is taken. But space solar power is an open opportunity to do something that will utterly transform the relationship of human beings to the solar system within which they live.
That's great. Howard, as a former entertainment professional, you worked in PR and worked with some of the biggest names ever in pop culture history, and you have a book called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me: A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. I do have there it is. There it is. Can you hold it just a little bit closer so we can see it? Yeah. And a forward by Joan Jett. And I love Joan Jett songs. That's awesome. I have a section on culture in my book, because space is really, it's great. It's that it has its own culture. It's influenced by culture. It creates its own culture. A lot of other, it's not like, medical doctors. If you're just, an anesthesiologist, get to say, the culture of anesthesiology, people are talking about
right.
Or the IRS, people walking around with the shirt that says taxes,
Yeah.
I got my, or have you filed your return? But people still wear NASA t-shirts. I see them all the time in NASA hats all around the world. So space has this really amazing thing. And then we saw a song that was, I don't know, it was, David Bowie's song that was, that has been reimagined so many times. Major Tom, that Chris Hadfield did. And then Elon, once again, did this great coup d'etat, taking his Tesla Roadster with Starman in it. There was just so many enmeshed stories, and just, the meta goes so deep, Howard. How did you, let's just talk about Starman and David Bowie. Did you ever meet David Bowie?
No, David Bowie's, when I was editing a magazine a rock magazine of all things. And when I was credited with creating a whole new genre, the heavy metal magazine, a representative from David Bowie's manager's office came to me every month with a stack of slide sheets this thick and let me take my pick
Wait,
of them.
what's a
And they
slide
showed,
sheet, Howard? I don't know
a
what that
slide
is.
sheet is a sheet of little slides from 35 millimeter cameras.
Okay.
And you have to hold it up to the light and
Okay.
look at it with a magnifying glass.
Okay.
So it's hundreds of pictures she would bring me, maybe thousands of pictures. And it's what David Bowie had just done that was startling and visual that month. But I never got to meet David. I met people around him. Of course, I kept track of his career. But the real question is, I got into theoretical physics and microbiology at the age of 10. By the age of 12, I had accumulated my first minor scientific credentials. I'd co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. I had built my first Boolean algebra machine. I'd had a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo to discuss Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe and the interpretation of the Doppler shift. And I was tutored privately by the head of research and development for the company that made the high-tech valves for the first plane that broke the sound barrier and for the first plane that reached the edge of space. All this at the age of 12. When I was 16, I was working at the world's largest cancer research facility. And instead of doing what I was supposed to be doing, which was research on immunology, I was trying to solve a problem in theoretical physics called the charge parity and time problem. And in the process came up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that predicted something called dark energy, which wouldn't be discovered for another 38 years. So that's who I really am, a science person. And at the age of 10 and 11, I had been carrying around engineering manuals in my shirt pockets that gave you the acceleration speeds, the speeds you would need to reach in order to get to something that nobody had ever reached yet, orbit. And I had a big poster on my wall of all of the sounding rockets that had been tested at White Sands, New Mexico, and each altitude record that each of them had broken. So I was seriously into space back then. So the big question is how I got from science into popular culture. And I got into popular culture because I was fascinated by the ecstatic experience from the age of 13. I was fascinated by the gods inside of us. And I wasn't going to find those in grad school. I got fellowships at 4 grad schools in what's now called neuroscience and realized it was going to be Auschwitz for the mind. And I would never be able to get near that ecstatic experience that I was pursuing. And I knew William James, I heard of a book when I was 14 called The Varieties of the Religious Experience. And it sounded like somebody was totally on my wavelength. It took me 4 months to track down that book. And William James outlined 7 extraordinary experiences. George Fox in Lichfield, England, saw rivers of blood coming from the sky and flooding the streets of Lichfield. St. Teresa in her cell at night, her dark, cold stone cell, felt angels coming through the walls and piercing her guts with a sword that gave her an astonishing feeling, and the experience of flying over the face of the globe with the glory and love of God just illuminating her. And James said, look, I can't explain these things. So I'm leaving them to you. You will have tools 50 years from now that I don't have scientifically. But the one thing he said that made the most difference was all of these experiences are psychopathological. All of them are mental illness. But in the hands of the right person, the psychopathological can become the engine of history. St. Teresa established a movement within the Catholic Church that is still alive today. It's 700 years later, approximately. George Fox established a movement called the Quaker movement, which is still alive today. These people took their delusions and they turned them into engines of history. So I wanted to track down the gods inside and those extraordinary experiences that are the engines of history. I wasn't going to be allowed to get anywhere near that if I went into grad school. And I would never be allowed to get near it in my entire career in all probability. So I jumped into something I knew absolutely nothing about, popular culture. And I found myself by accident editing a magazine And it turned out to be, of all things, a rock and roll magazine. And as I said, I was credited by Chet Flippo, one of the founding editors of Rolling Stone, with creating a whole new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. And then I founded the biggest PR firm in the music industry. And I had an approach to it that was so radically different from any that the music industry had ever seen. It was ridiculous because I came from science. I came from the world of Martin Gardner's mathematical games section in the Scientific American. And I was able to analyze the field, see the rituals that were standard in the field, look at the ones that worked and keep them, look at the ones that didn't work and throw them away, and then invent whole new techniques for doing things. And it worked. It helped you understand that there was something about Michael Jackson that was indescribable, but extremely important. That there was something about Prince that was life-changing. And again, possibly indescribable, but extremely important. And it helped me establish icons. It helped me take the gods inside of these artists and make these people gods for the public. It helped me step into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made and become a myth maker myself. And I came to understand the value of icons to people. They're incredibly important in people's lives. The entertainment industry is suffering now because it doesn't have genuine icon makers. I don't mean idol makers. I mean icon makers. And an icon is somebody whose picture you can put up on your wall when you're 12 years old or 13 years old in your bedroom, you can grow up on and can shape the structure of the rest of your life. And you have to, these icons have to be worthy of that kind of attention from you. They have to be worthy of being the trellises on which you will grow. And I concentrated on that for 17 years until I finally got sick and went back to my science full time. But it was an astonishing experience. It was, the people say amazing things about this book. They say it's not a book of rock and roll memorabilia. It's a book that can utterly change your life because it is about the gods inside. And you have them, I have them, we all have them. And if we are lucky, we are able to tap them. But tapping them is something we can focus on doing. It's something we can make sure that we do. Or we can lose those gods inside and become what T.S. Eliot called the hollow men. The men whose heads are filled with straw. The people who simply mechanically go about doing whatever their business is and waste their lives. That's not what any of us want to become. And this book is about that.
Howard, I think that's a good reason why I think why we're friends, because I think we're attracted to being independent, fiery spirits. And as you wrote in Genius of the Beast, it said, the truth at any price, even at the price of your life. And
yes.
And I think the second rule is about looking, sometimes you have to look right under your nose,
Yes.
look at things in new ways. And so even though I've heard some of these stories before, I always find, Howard, new insights, and it gets me deeper. It's like, why does, the student coming back to, they're at the temple or whatever, and they're sometimes given the same lesson, ultimately, right, because you're going deeper and deeper. It's like, what is it? There was a joke, when you're passing the Buddha driving, what do you do? And somebody said something's like hit him or it was something. You just get deeper into this, into the story and the experience. Before we kind of close out, is there, with my book, and I'm still trying to improve my own craft as a writer, and I looked at the wonderful way you can tell stories, and it was one of the things that I wanted to do a little bit differently was taking some people alive and dead, some of their gems, and including it, embedding it with some of my stories and research, and making space accessible, because it's still a nuanced, a complicated, an esoteric thing, and no doubt difficult. And I'm so thankful for the people that are doing the really granular detail, the electrical technician, the electrical engineer who has a very specific role and skill that they need to do in space. And it's really funny. I think my wife is in here to distract me for a moment. Hello. She's, But let me just a second before I kind of lost my train of thought for a moment, is
Well,
how,
you're grateful to the guys who were granular, like the
yes,
electrical
grateful today for
engineer.
granular, but the book is, I want to bring into this a new audience. It's as if it's 1993 or 1995. You've heard of the internet, you've heard of the word email. Amazon's not quite started yet. You know, we can even bake up a few years. Let's just say it's like 96 and Amazon is starting. You're like, okay, you can buy books, you can buy a few things online. And if you're like, look, there's going to be this thing where like you're going to be able to get food delivered to your house. You're going to be able to go on a date, never leaving your house. There's going to be all these things that are emerging from the internet. And space is a little, I
It's a
assert that
very
it's a
good
little like
analogy.
that, that
Yeah.
it's like this in the 90s. You're going to, you know, even if you don't want to, even if you don't care about what the internet is, it's going to affect your life. That's who I'm trying to reach. It's these people that sort of say, why should I care about like GPS or satellites? You know, that's the audience that I'm trying to reach. And I know that a portion, and it could just be one person whose life is transformed by saying, aha, I want to create something. I want to do something that's going to just improve my own life, or, you know, or become an explorer or a creator or an entrepreneur, or, you know, or create that pharmaceutical that's going to like, you know, kill a certain type of cancer. That's what I'm trying to essentially spark and be a catalyst for. That's, and that's kind of where I'm at today. And I'm so grateful, Howard, for our friendship, because I think when we first met and I started reading your books, it was an inspiration for me to one day try to tell my own story, but also in a way that, you know, felt authentic to me. But I really appreciate you know, your work, because it's been very influential. And I want to, you know, it was just a having you as a friend has been kind of an inspiring spirit on the path that we're all
Well,
on.
I've enjoyed it tremendously. And I better run because I have to be on 545 radio stations tonight. And I don't know what I'm going to be talking about yet. I have to see if my host has given me the topic, because it takes 5 hours of research.
Howard, you're a master at this. You've got it. You're going to have it licked.
So wish me luck. Just a final word. A nation that looks up goes up. A nation that looks down goes down. What we need in space in order to create the narrative, the story that you're talking about, is to realize that there is a paradise above our heads. It's a paradise that's ours for the making. We will have to make it the same way we were greened and gardened this particular poison hill of stone, with unimaginable gardens, with unimaginable deeds. And we have to start imagining those deeds and creating that paradise that will uplift all of humankind, because that's what motivates people, and it's what nature, it's what evolution demands of us.
Beautifully said, Howard. That was Howard Bloom. Howard, thank you so much for having this conversation today.
Thanks, Rob. So I will see you again, hopefully soon in person.
That sounds wonderful, Howard. Have a great evening.
Okay, thanks,
Talk to you later.
Rob.
Bye.
Talk to you soon.
Okay.